The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on Key Battles of the Revolutionary War. In the previous episode, we saw the Declaration of Independence being signed and America formally announcing itself to the world as an independent country.
Woohoo!
James, does that mean the confusion is now behind us so we don't have to call them colonists or patriots or whatever and we could just call them Americans?
I think that's safe to do from now on. Let's do that. I like that idea.
All right, well, terminology is much more simple, but the war is not simple. It is going to get down and dirty. We're not going to have small little skirmishes here with a few hundred soldiers that are symbolic. Things are going to get hairy, and things are going to happen in New York, which was, in some senses, always going to be a destination of the British. But before we go back into this narrative, I just want to set up a little bit about what is happening in the war and how New York is indicative of how, in some senses, the British war planning was schizophrenic. Because on one hand, they have a rebellion that they have to put down, and England has a global, Britain has a global empire at this point, and they're not subtle when it comes to such matters. But on the other hand, the king knew that he had a problem if he was too harsh and turned the colonies into a permanent enemy. And the leaders of this war effort, the Howe brothers, one who commanded the British fleet, which was Sir Richard Howe, and the other, the British Army, General William Howe, whom we've met earlier, they were charged with ending the rebellion, but they were also peace commissioners. And General Howe had already unsuccessfully attempted to crush the rebellion at Bunker Hill through a demonstration of raw British power. This didn't work. This just left the British with heavy casualties, but it also strengthened American resolve and inspired the Patriots to believe that they could eventually beat England. So there's something that's happening here. It's kind of like the Vietnam War, where the people trying to fight the battle are moving back and forth between the carrot and the stick, and they don't know if they want to win the war, crush them, or befriend the inhabitants. And these policies go back and forth. So that's the context of what's happening. But let's move now to New York and see where we're at in the war effort. So, James, can you set us up with some background?
Okay, we left the British Army, the main British Army. We left them a couple episodes back in Boston, and they evacuated Boston in the spring of 1776, being surrounded by up to possibly 20,000, we'll call them colonials at that time because they were still colonials, but we're going to put that to bed. Washington's army, a combined force of Continental Army and militia, had nearly 20,000, and the British were bottled up on that that ping pong battle that we keep talking about. I think maybe this will be the last time, Scott.
It's too bad.
Anyway, they leave and they go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a very safe place for them for rest and refit, resupply. But George Washington wasn't stupid. He knew that they're not just going to go, let's just go there permanently. He knew that they were going to be backed to the American colonies. And he was pretty sure it was going to be New York City. So, being really convinced of this, about 2 weeks after the British departure, he traveled to New York City to oversee the building of defenses. He wanted to be there personally and actually see it with his own eyes. He also organized the Continental Army into divisions, each of which had some Continentals and some militia units. He really didn't want to have all militia units and all Continentals, because he never really trusted militia. He'd worked with too many militia back in the French and Indian War. He'd commanded some militia. He wanted the army to be as professional as possible. Now, the army was suffering from disease, and many of the soldiers were leaving because their enlistments ran out. They also suffered from a shortage of supplies. They tried to recruit new soldiers, but this went slowly. Why would you go, if you're a farmer, why would you leave your farm and risk your family starving to go off and join the army and probably die of disease, but if not, possibly get shot or get blown up by a cannonball or some kind of explosive ordnance and then hardly ever have any food. It's just not really, and not get paid. So it's not a really attractive prospect for a lot of prospering or even middle class or lower class American farmers. So it's really hard for Washington to get troops. Now, I want to talk about a man that we're going to see in several of our battles starting today, and that's one of Washington's key subordinates, and that was Major General Charles Lee. So let's stop and do a little mini bio on Charles Lee. Charles Lee had served in the British Army for 16 years, including the Battle of the Monongahela. We've talked about that battle. That was a key early battle in the French and Indian War, which was a disaster for the British. They were absolutely routed by the French and a combined French and Indian force. The commanding general, General Braddock, was killed, but Washington was there. Lee was there. Thomas Gage, who we talked about quite a while ago, Gage was out of the picture now, but he was there. I believe that General Gates, Horatio Gates, who we'll talk about a lot later, was there as well. So there were quite a few future commanders on both sides in the Revolutionary War at this battle, including Charles Lee. So Charles Lee was a professional soldier. He was not like Washington. Washington had served a few years in the Virginia militia back in the French and Indian War, and that was it. He'd been out of military service for quite some time. Not so Lee. Lee had fought, well, we'll talk more about his career a little bit later. Lee was a talkative man, so the opposite of Washington in that regard. He was profane. He had a potty mouth, we would say today, which Washington detested swearing. Washington used to outlaw swearing and even punish people for it from time to time.
Yeah, he would fine soldiers, or even worse if he heard them swearing.
Yeah, can you imagine that? You think of the military today as just, constant
not quite the same
swearing.
system, yeah.
Yeah. Charles Lee was sloppy in his dress. He didn't really care how he looked. Again, the opposite of Washington. Washington was always just a fashion plate. That's I think that's an old term that nobody knows what it means anymore, Scott. I may need to define that. Basically, Washington was always perfectly attired. And Charles Lee was fond of being unconventional, which again, he couldn't be more opposite than Washington. All those points that I just mentioned, exact 180-degree opposite from Washington. Now, Charles Lee had married the daughter of a Seneca chief. So he'd kind of got himself an Indian bride. He had fought in North America, as I mentioned, and he'd also fought in Portugal. In 1765, he joined the Polish army. So he'd really fought all over the world, at least all over the Western world. In 1775, he was appointed as a major general in the Continental Army, second only in rank to Washington. So he really was Washington's second in command. He was quick-tempered. He was arrogant. One thing I want to mention, Scott, is that he always went around with a bunch of dogs. He was never anywhere without 2, 3, 4 dogs. Just kind of an odd guy. He wouldn't ever leave his dogs behind. Guess he couldn't find a suitable kennel on the front lines.
They were his support animal. That's how he was able to function.
No kidding. Yeah. Washington had originally put Charles Lee in charge of New York City defenses. Later, he sent him down to Charleston, which we talked about in a previous episode. So that's Lee, really the antithesis of George Washington, and just kind of an odd guy.
Well, a fun fact about him, you mentioned he had vast military experience. He had quantity, if not the quality, of Washington. And for that reason, the Continental Congress, or many in that, originally wanted Lee to be commander-in-chief instead of Washington. So keep that in mind as we see how the war effort goes. I think things would have turned out a little bit differently if Lee had been in overall command. And you can decide for yourself, dear listener, if you think it would have been more positive or more negative.
Yeah, I think hold off on your judgment there. Some of you may have already made a judgment on that one, but wait till we talk about Lee's got some fun surprises planned for us later. So, all right. So let's talk about, you mentioned the Howe brothers.
Yes.
Admiral Sir Richard Howe, Lord Howe, as they would have called him at the time, and his brother General William Howe. They're working as a team to try to go down and snuff out the rebellion. But as you mentioned, they're not. It's not a scorched earth campaign. They're not there to search and destroy. They're using a gloved hand. So after William Howe left Boston. He took his army, as I mentioned, to Nova Scotia and got some time to just relax, get some rest, get some reinforcements, get some new supplies. Finally, on June 11th, Howe and the army sailed for New York. And on the way, he met up with his brother, Sir Admiral Richard Howe, the commander of the British Navy. Howe and his leading elements sailed into the lower bay in the New York area on June 25th. And there were so many ships that one American soldier wrote, "I thought all London was afloat." There was another quote I saw that it was like a forest of masts. There were just so many ships with their masts, and it was pretty awesome in the old-fashioned sense of the word, Scott. It was a shock and awe campaign, and it worked on a lot of the Americans. They were kind of like, uh-oh. Great. 4 days later, the rest of Howe's force arrived, and on July 3rd, the British troops landed unopposed on Staten Island. Now, let's do a mental map, Scott. I learned so much about New York geography when I was researching this. I being a Texas boy, I didn't know hardly anything. I've never been to New York City.
Yeah, listeners, please consult maps. We have them on the website, and New Yorkers assume everybody knows what the 5 boroughs are. We might recognize the name. I know that Manhattan is an island. I don't know anything about the geography of the rest of it. Guess what? If you're from New York, no one else knows anything, so get over yourself, and we're going to correct that lacuna in New York geographical knowledge here. So please consult the map, and James, as always, will do well explaining the geographical features.
Yes. So let me pull up our big picture map here and try to describe this to our listeners. Another thing, too, even if you know current New York geography, it was totally different back in 1776, just as Boston was. Okay, so you've got New York City proper at the time was way, way smaller than it is today, both in terms of population and in terms of geography. If you picture... how do we picture a finger coming down from the mainland? Okay, so from the north, down in the middle of your mental map, here comes like a finger hanging down, or let's say a banana hanging down or something.
Or an udder, if you prefer.
An udder, yeah. That would be utterly hard to imagine, but
we're gonna milk this for all it's worth.
Good.
We'll be here all week, folks.
Yeah, listener, you just thought we were going to talk about the Battle of New York. We're actually going to just do puns the rest of the episode. All right, so on the left side, and I'm oversimplifying because the reality is it's more oriented northeast to southwest, but just work with me, listener. Think in your mental map, right down in the middle is coming an udder or a finger or a banana. To the left of that is the Hudson River. To the right of that is the East River. And then just below it, and also a little bit to the right side is Long Island. Okay, Long Island is huge compared to the finger, or the udder, and the udder is Manhattan Island. Okay, so Long Island is below it, below Manhattan, and to the right, and then to the left of Long Island, separated by New York Bay, is Staten Island. By the way, going back to the udder or the finger coming down, as I said, to the left is the Hudson. To the left of that is the mainland, and that's New Jersey. Okay, so the British are going to land on Staten Island, which is somewhat of a distance away from Manhattan itself, and just to the left of Long Island. All right, are you thoroughly confused, listener? I'm sorry if that wasn't very good, but if that didn't make sense, consult a map later. Okay, so they landed on Staten Island, and by August, they had 32,000 men, including 8,000 Hessians there. Those are those German mercenaries that we talked about, just really the ultimate professionals, just really scary, kick-butt soldiers. Admiral Howe issued a proclamation stating proposed peace terms, and he also sent letters proposing peace negotiations to the governors of the states of the area and to Washington himself. Now, Washington did agree to meet with the House, and that happened. He didn't meet with him personally. He met with an emissary, but nothing came of the meeting. So, Washington didn't feel like they wanted him to apologize and to admit wrongdoing, and he said, well, we haven't done anything wrong. We're standing up for our rights. Also, a delegation from Congress was sent, including John Adams, of course, and Benjamin Franklin, of course. Those guys are everywhere. We're constantly talking about them. But that was inconclusive as well. Now, Washington thought the British would try to sail up the Hudson. Okay, so remember, that's the river on the left side of Manhattan Island, that finger or udder we talked about. And he thought they would attack the west side of Manhattan. Really, the British had a huge advantage here because they had ships, and Manhattan is surrounded by water on almost every side. I guess technically every side, it's an island, but there's water everywhere, and it's separating. He's got some troops on Long Island. He's got some troops on Manhattan Island. He's got some on the mainland. So Washington has no idea where the British are going to strike. So he decides to put a few troops everywhere to try to cover everything instead of centering all of his troops in one place. And that makes sense. In one sense, you could say, well, he's weakening his force by splitting it up in the face of a superior enemy, that's rule number one in war: never divide your forces in front of a superior enemy. But on the other hand, what if he put all of his troops in one place and the British just bypass that and they just keep going up? And what he really didn't want them to take the city. He wanted to defend the city. Some people said Washington should just burn the city, burn New York, and retreat. But he didn't want to do that. A lot of the people of New York didn't want him to do that either. So he thought they were going to attack the west side of Manhattan. So he's going to try to cover his bases everywhere, as I mentioned. So he orders the hurried completion of two forts begun by General Lee, Charles Lee, called Fort Washington on Manhattan Island and Fort Lee. That's appropriate, isn't it? Named after the supreme commander and the second in command. They didn't have a lot of time. Okay, give them a break. They didn't have a lot of time to think up cool names for forts. So let's just name them after the generals. He had fortifications built at Brooklyn Heights, and Brooklyn Heights at this time is much smaller than modern day Brooklyn. Brooklyn Heights is just I don't know how to describe it, kind of like the northwestern part of Long Island that's right below Manhattan Island. So he's got fortifications there. It's high ground. And he also had some built on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. So that's Washington's defensive plan. What do you think of that, Scott? Pretty good plan, or?
I makes perfect sense to me. I'm not a military commander, but before we get into the battle, I wanted to mention something interesting about diplomatic efforts happening at this time that I think are a good window into the confusion about how do the British relate to this colony that now proclaims itself a nation. And as you mentioned, Howe sends out letters to governors and also to Washington himself. When Howe sent a personal letter to Washington, he addressed it simply as George Washington Esquire, and Washington refuses the letter. The reason, not because Howe sent it, but he thinks it hadn't been addressed to him in his capacity as commander-in-chief of the American Army. Mm-hmm. And he argues that as a private individual, he can't have communications with emissaries from the king or commander of the British forces. So Howe tries again and addresses a letter to George Washington, et cetera, and et cetera can just be sort of...
yeah, just cover all your bases.
Yeah, fill in the blank with whatever you wish, good sir. But Washington replies that et ceteras implies everything and nothing, and he stands on his prerogative to be addressed by his title. But Congress in September sent a delegation to meet with Howe, and that became known as the Staten Island Peace Conference. And you mentioned the different delegates that are there, Adams, Franklin, and they learned that Howe really didn't have power to negotiate because everything had to be referred back to Parliament and the King. So due to this communication gap, British commanders do have leeway to act on the ground. And whether it's the Howe perspective that will handle things lightly to try to win the hearts of the colonials, or whether it's later a Cornwallis approach where it's scorched earth, the British are fully resolved for a full return of the colonists to the King's allegiance, but without the rights that Englishmen in Great Britain enjoyed. So the negotiations weren't to go, but I just thought I would mention that of Washington concerned about honorifics. I think that's a nice little window into his character, the great man that he is. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So what happens in the end of August when this battle kicks off?
All right. On August 22nd, General Howe deployed 15 soldiers and 40 cannon on the western shore of Long Island. Okay, so they're ferrying across from Staten Island, which again is on the left side of our mental map, a little bit across the water onto Long Island, which is on the right. Actually, we're kind of in the middle of the map. But anyway, Washington, he knew this was going on. He saw this happening, but he thought it was a feint. In other words, kind of like a fake or a small attack designed to throw him off. And really the main attack is going to come somewhere else. He didn't think this was the main body of the troops. So he sent just a few troops to the Continental commander there, who was John Sullivan. John Sullivan, we've seen, was involved in the Canada campaign, but now he's been brought down to Long Island, and he's at least for now in command of the troops on Long Island. Washington's army, as I mentioned, was spread very thin. Part of it was on Manhattan Island. Part was behind fortifications in Brooklyn Heights. Part was south of Brooklyn and deployed on high ground. Also, there was part of it was in Fort Washington that we mentioned earlier on the Hudson on the Manhattan side. Part was in Fort Lee, which is on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. So they're all over the place. But I want to focus on this part that I mentioned that's actually south of Brooklyn. They're outside of the main fortifications, but they're on high ground. American troops, at the time, it was a hilly, there were these hills on Long Island. I don't know if they still have hills, or I imagine they've probably leveled them to some degree, but I wouldn't know. Never been there. But anyway, but imagine, so here are the British troops coming from the west and the south of Long Island, beginning to move to their north and to their east, and they encounter American troops on high ground, and there are some passes between these hills, and the Americans had covered all the passes except for one. Here is a huge mistake that the American troops make. They did not cover Jamaica Pass, which is on the far right. It only had about 5 men guarding it, which 5 guys, can you imagine being one of those 5 guys? So if you want to pull up your map, Scott, it's the Long Island map. So that the British send a group of guys under Cornwallis and General Clinton, and they go around and they run into these 5 guys. And needless to say, they make short work of the 5 because he's got several thousand. Let's see, 4,000 to be specific.
There's not going to be a Thermopylae situation here where they hold him off. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, right. 300. So they don't even have 300. They've got 5. They should make another movie called 5, Scott.
Well, they just get shot. The movie's about it's 5 minutes long. It's more of a YouTube video than a feature-length film.
Yeah, no kidding. You and me and 3 other guys can reenact that. But anyway, so think of the troops. The Americans are laid out east to west. The British are moving around to the east, and they find this opening, and they get through it. Of course, they capture the 5 guys that are holding the Jamaica Pass. And at the same time, 7,000 British soldiers under General James Grant, no relation to Ulysses S. Grant, of course, they attack the American right, which is actually on our left because the Americans are facing south. And then they'll have 5,000 under General von Heister, who is a Hessian. They hit the American center. So they're keeping the Americans busy. The Americans are outnumbered. They're being hit. The Americans are being hit on their left and on their center. The American right is the left side of our map, and then the center, and then the left is about to be swept up by these guys that snuck through that pass. Clinton captures Jamaica Pass, and he gets in the rear of the American position. And if you've listened to our Civil War series, you know that you never want to be in that position. You never want to be a soldier and you're fighting people in front of you, and then all of a sudden you realize you've got enemy behind you as well. That's bad. That's called being surrounded or enveloped. So needless to say, the Americans, these ones that are on the high ground south of Brooklyn Heights, they are in big trouble. But they behave admirably. They don't break and run completely. The right actually kind of does. The right, which was being hit by General Grant, the British General Grant, it starts to collapse. But the retreat was covered by forces under General William Alexander. And this is an interesting guy, Scott, William Alexander. He called himself Lord Stirling. He claimed that he had his father had inherited a title back in Scotland a long time ago. And so he's the only American commander that claims to be part of the British nobility. It's kind of funny. Lord Stirling. I don't know what George Washington called him. I'm sure he didn't say my lord, because Stirling was a brigadier general, two ranks below Washington. But anyway, Lord Stirling does a really good job, as does Sullivan. Only a handful of their troops make it to safety, though. Many are killed, even more are captured. Lord Stirling himself is captured, as is Sullivan. The rest of the American army scrambled back, and again, for mental map people, they're going north. They're going up to we would say, from our perspective, the top of the island, just across from Manhattan, across the East River. The East River was at their backs, and unfortunately, the East River was dominated by the British fleet. So the Americans are in a really bad situation right now. They're essentially surrounded. They are facing south, even though they're behind some really strong fortifications. They've got thousands of British soldiers coming up toward them, and at their back is water. That is never a good situation to be in. They have nowhere to retreat to. It's not looking good. This might be the end of the rebellion. But at 4 p.m. on the 27th of August, the same day the attack started, well, it's actually not the same day. It's a day later. But 4 p.m., General Howe mysteriously called off the attack. He just said, oh, that's good, we're done. So General Howe is not, he's not a Ulysses S. Grant or a Robert E. Lee or a William T. Sherman. He does not have a personal motto of hit hard and hit often. He's more of a cautious man. I think he was afraid that he might overextend himself. He didn't want to throw a bunch of people into fortifications. He didn't want to attack a fortified position. It was starting to get dark, or it would be pretty soon. Not at 4 p.m., obviously, but his troops were tired. I'm sure it was hot. This is August. So he calls off the attack. So this is what we call the Battle of Long Island, basically. In summary, the British jumped onto Long Island. They snuck around the American left, which is the British right, and they enveloped part of the American forces, captured many of them, and the rest had to retreat to Brooklyn Heights. And Howe figures, well, we'll get them tomorrow. We've got plenty of people. We've got the Navy. In the fight, the British lost about 388 casualties. That's 64 killed, 293 wounded, and 31 missing. And so that's significant, but it's not huge numbers. But that's, again, total casualties of just under 400. The American casualties, on the other hand, were 2,100. 300 killed, which is about 5 times as many as the British had killed. 800 wounded, which is more than double the British. But what really hurt was 1,000 captured, 1,000. And many of these had surrendered. So it looks like the jig is up for the Continental Army here. But, the British are planning to go up and attack at Brooklyn Heights the next morning. But something really interesting happens that evening. A nor'easter blows in. So it's a wind from the northeast. It blows in, and it prevents Admiral Howe's ships from sailing into the East River. So much for the British Navy. Now the Americans still have the East River to their backs, but at least they don't have an East River filled with British ships. That helps. And then it began raining. It poured down rain, and it made it nearly impossible for the British to hear or see the Americans. And the storm held for 2 days. For 2 days, the British just sat there and were miserable, and the Americans were miserable, but nothing really happens. Then, and this is one of these things that some people might say, and people did at the time, might wonder if this is some kind of divine intervention, because on the evening of the 29th, as the rain is letting up, a big, thick fog settled in, and it made the Americans basically invisible. And so the next morning, overnight, by the way, with this big fog, the British continued to hear the sound of Americans talking, the sound of hammers and shovels. They saw campfires. On the morning of the 30th, the fog lifted, and so Howe ordered the British scouts to advance, and they crept up toward Brooklyn Heights, expecting to find the Americans there waiting to make one last stand, to boldly fight off the invading British. And so the British climb up and they look over the fortifications and they see nothing. The Americans, gone. They had just disappeared, it seemed. Very disappointing if you're British.
Yeah, they did everything right, and the Americans get a gigantic mulligan in a sense.
Yeah. Either God was looking out for them or somebody was looking out for them. The weather was looking out for them. Something happened, or it was just plain luck, depending on your beliefs.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
What had happened is all through the night, Washington had rounded up a bunch of ships, and they were piloted by some men from Marblehead, Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel John Glover. We'll see him again later, too. These ships, just a few at a time, they ferried Washington's army over from Brooklyn across the river into Manhattan, which is, of course, at the time much safer. And they muffled their oars. They did everything they could to be quiet. But at the same time, they left a few guys until the very last minute in the Brooklyn Heights. And their orders were to make noise, act like you're several thousand people, keep the campfires burning to fool the British. And it worked perfectly. It was a real roll of the dice, Scott. But Washington, and this is not going to be the last time that Washington gambles and wins. I think if they'd had Vegas back then, he probably should have gone.
Yeah, I mean,
made some money.
Napoleon said something about, I don't care about a man's skill, find me one who is lucky, something along those lines. I don't know.
Yeah, and Washington, time and time again, we're going to see this. And Washington, to his great credit, he left on the very last boat. The British were just beginning to search the area. And because of this bold action and this gutsy action on the part of Washington and his army, 9,500 men were saved. Just think if those, well, also thanks to the weather,
Yeah.
if those 9,500 men had been captured in Brooklyn Heights, that probably would have been it, particularly if they would have captured Washington. I mean, who's going to lead the army after that? Charles Lee? I don't think so.
Hey, Benedict Arnold's still around. He's a loyal patriot, right?
Well, yeah.
He's
he probably
loyal.
would have tried. He was a little too gutsy, though. All right, so Washington's defeat revealed his deficiencies as a strategist. You know, that's one thing we tend to think of Washington as this brilliant genius that did everything right. He never did anything wrong. But actually, he made a lot of mistakes here. He split his forces. He had inexperienced generals who misunderstood the situation. And his raw troops had fled in disorder at the first shots, at least, in the Battle of Long Island, not in Brooklyn. However, his daring nighttime retreat has been seen by some historians as one of his greatest military feats. Other historians concentrate on the failure of British naval forces to prevent the withdrawal. So, Long Island is going to end up being the biggest battle of the Revolutionary War. 10,000 Americans and 20,000 British and Hessians participated. So, yeah, we may want to stop and discuss this. I know you've got some other things you want to add, but maybe we'll talk about this. So what is it? What do you think, listener? Is this a brilliant move by Washington, or is it a big blunder by William Howe? Is William Howe the George McClellan of the British Army?
Or is Washington the Fabian who keeps retreating until the supply lines are stretched too far?
Yeah, so... it was Washington, the Robert E. Lee, who picks his battles and only fights when he wants to and then retreats when he needs to and gets away. Interesting food for thought. What do you think, Scott? I'm putting you on the spot here.
There's so many different ways you can argue this, because if Washington is dinged anywhere, the way that people make them feel smart with history is oftentimes always to take the revisionist tack. And I do it a lot too, so I'm by no means innocent. And with Washington, because there's this aura about him with how instrumental he is at every single stage of the early parts of America, the fault that they'll find with him is he was a poor strategist. That great statesman, great figurehead, impeccable character to provide hope at the lowest times of the war effort. But when it came to actual on-the-ground strategy, he ranks low in the pantheon of American commanders, that you could find many people in the Civil War, even the Revolutionary War, who could best him in terms of strategy. Other authors have written against this, that they're trying to push back against that narrative, that one may see a poor planner, others might see a Fabian who, in the onslaught of Hannibal of Carthage, is simply trying to exhaust a superior tactician by stretching his supply lines way too thin. So I would sort of strike the middle ground, that I would say I don't think he's a hidden genius, that history is misunderstood. I think it would be very hard for Washington's faults not to be consumed in the aura of his other achievements, especially in early American history in the 19th century, when many of these early histories are being written. I would put it somewhere in the middle. What do you think?
I agree with you. I think both are true. I think Washington does. I mean, he deserves some blame for. Well, I don't even know if he deserves blame for splitting his forces, because again, like I said, he didn't know where the British were going to hit. So let's say he'd put everybody in Brooklyn. Maybe he couldn't have got all of them out of there, because he's got about 20,000 total in the vicinity. So, maybe he was doing okay. I don't know. You can look at it both ways. Certainly the retreat was a brilliant move. It was gutsy. It could have gone horribly, though. It's one of those things, Scott, where, if you're watching a football game and your team is down by 6 points in the fourth quarter and they throw a Hail Mary and it works, you say, oh, that was brilliant. That coach deserves a raise and so on. But if they mess it up, you're like, man, that was stupid. Why would you do something so crazy? So it certainly could have gone either way. But Washington, he deserves credit for trying something that might save his army. He certainly, if he had just kept those 9,000 soldiers in Brooklyn Heights, they would have eventually, the weather wasn't going to be bad forever. So eventually they would have been captured. I think Washington, one of his greatness as a commander, I agree with what you said. One thing about Washington that really made him an effective commander, even though he wasn't a brilliant tactician, was his ability to learn and grow. Scott and I did that whole Civil War battle series, and we saw some generals make the same mistake again and again and again. Or a succession of generals would make the same mistake again and again and again. It's like they never learned, but Washington is going to figure out. Washington would like to do set piece battles, European style. That was the kind of commander he wanted to be. He wanted to just go out on an open field and duke it out and win, but he realized that was not going to work. So he had to come up with a different style of warfare. So he comes up with a more defensive style, which was called at the time a war of posts. He was the master of the strategic retreat, and then he could occasionally strike back and really kind of be almost like a gadfly, just really be pesky and pick at the British Army and deal some small but morale building defeats from time to time.
I suppose the positive take on all this is that Washington was not a career military man, and he could have been a little bit rusty from the French Indian War a decade ago and was still shaking that off and getting used to very large battles, if we want to give the most positive take on him reacclimating to how to lead an army. Well, one other thing, too, I want to mention with this, just to give some context about what it was like as an American soldier when you're retreating. On the case of Long Island, you're enveloped. It was terrifying. It would be terrifying in any war, but just to flesh out the particular circumstances, James mentioned the thousands of Hessians that were involved in the fight, and the Hessians were trained mercenaries. Many of the British were Scottish Highlanders. Both these groups ruthlessly bayoneted many of the trapped Americans, many of whom were trained to surrender. So of those who were fatalities, a lot of those could have had their hands up. Part of the reason is that the British had lied to the Hessians and told the Germans that Americans would take no prisoners, but would rather hack them to death and mutilate them with tomahawks, as if they're using Indian-style warfare.
Ouch.
Now, many of the Patriots did carry a tomahawk, and that was true for almost all riflemen. but they would be bayoneted after they surrendered. And amongst the Hessians, we talked about them a little bit in an earlier episode, but to give you a sense of the group, the officers in the Hessian Corps were typically made up of German aristocrats, but the enlisted men came from the lower strata of German society. They'd be poor, unemployed. And what's interesting is that a lot of German boys enlisted for the chance to go to America, and when they had the opportunity, many of them deserted. This goes on later in the war when there are some rough turns. But after 1781, Hessians are no longer used as pickets as the desertion rates are too high. So this leads to some of the early German communities in the United States of Hessians or Germans that just leave and settle there. So many of the Hessians many of them become American citizens later on. I'm sure there's a few histories written about these Hessians turned early Americans, but so as much as the British have Americans have problems with desertion, the British will have it as well as the war goes on. All right, well, this is too big of a battle, I think, to handle in one episode. James, anything else before we sign off here?
No, but like you implied, we're just getting started with this New York campaign. There's a lot more fighting to go.
Yes, the British are down, but they're definitely not out, and the Americans are going to have a lot more to deal with. So we'll get into all that in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast. If you'd like more info, go to keybattlesoftherevolutionarywar.com, where you'll find show notes, maps, and other resources that we talk about in these episodes. And if you like the show, please rate and review us on the podcast player of your choice. It helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, my friends, grab your tankard of ale or glass of Madeira and raise a toast to liberty.